Right, thanks very much to David Kynaston. I'm going to talk to you about George Orwell and the Road to 1984. In Anthony Pole's novel Books to Furnish a Room, there's a bravura description of the novelist ex-Cracknell, an exotic, Britian, terminally elusive character, whom Pole later admitted was based on a writer called Julian McLaren Ross. Pole's account is worth quoting in full, where it offers not only a panoramic survey of McLaren Ross's mental landscape, but perhaps the best example of Pole's technique, whether in real life or on a printed page, of dealing with the individual personality. Cracknell, according to Pole's narrator, aimed at many roles. Cracknell wanted, amongst other things, to be a writer, a dandy, a lover, a comrade, an eccentric, a sage, a virtuoso, a good chap, a man of honour, a hard case, a spendthrift, an opportunist, a raisonneur, to be very rich, to be very poor, to possess 1,000 mistresses, to the heart of one love to whom he was ever faithful, to be on the best of terms with all men, to avenge savagely the lightest affront, to live for 100 years of honour, to die young and unknown, but recognised the following day as the most neglected genius of the age. Each of these ambitions has something to recommend it from one angle or another, with the possible exception being four, the only aim Cracknell achieved with unqualified mastery. This passage represents perhaps the fullest exposition of a concept that looms very large in all Pole's novels, the personal myth. What happens to the average human being during the course of his or her life, Pole insists, isn't really important. The decisive influence and the decisive stimulus is what he thinks happens to him and what he imagines that other people make of these circumstances. Life, according to Pole, is a process of self-mythologizing, an endless projection of oneself and those around one into roles and guises that enable the mythologist to cope with the setbacks and changes of plan that the average life throws up in the path of the person living it. The concept of the personal myth is all the more eye-opening when one applies it to Pole himself. Discussing Orwell, whom he knew intimately for nearly a decade, he offers an extraordinary account of an incident that took place in the nursery of Pole's youngest son, John, in the winter of 1947. Pole had gone to fetch a book, and coming back, he found the child's bed things slightly disturbed, and Orwell looking with a rather suspect interest at a painting on the wall. Rearranging the covers, Pole discovered, to his great surprise, a 9-inch Bowie knife. "Oh yes," Orwell remarked when this came to light, "I'd forgotten I gave him that to play with." All this, Pole decided, was much too big to be ignored. What was Orwell doing with the knife? Why did he obviously be playing with the child? And Pole's conclusion was that Orwell had created a kind of tableau, the equivalent of a mid-Victorian moral painting, the strong man moved by the child's weakness, whose central requirement was that he had to be discovered creating it. But in using Pole's template, my aim here is to examine Orwell's novels from the point of view of his personal myth, to speculate on the way in which he regarded himself as a human being and the manner in which he projected his visions of himself into his art. Now, Orwell's fiction consists almost exclusively of projections of himself, devious imaginative structures erected on the foundation of his own psychology and the particular environments in which he found himself when he wrote them. And nowhere is this grounding of the kind of person that Orwell imagined himself to be more evident than what Orwell thought of his novels after, and in some cases even before he finished writing them. As a human being, and to a lesser extent as a writer, Orwell was obsessed with the idea of failure. His attitude to his novels, consequently, is usually one of bitter disparagement. In 1946, shortly after the publication of Animal Farm, the book which made his name, he wrote the famous essay, Why I Write, for a little magazine named Gangrel. He hoped, in the future, to write another work of fiction, he told Gangrel's handful of readers. It is bound to be a failure. Every book is a failure. Every book. Ulysses, Vanity Fair, La Recherche du Temps Perdu, all of them. There's no getting away from this blanket disavowal of his own and everyone else's talent, for it had been there since the very start of his career. The idea of using a pseudonym and transforming himself from Eric Blair to George Orwell was first proposed to his agent in 1932 on the grounds that he was not proud of his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London. A Clergyman's Daughter, his second novel, was written off as bollocks, a word I've not actually found in any dictionary. The Keep the Aspidistra Flying, his fault, over which he claimed was sweating blood in his efforts to create a work of art, was later marked down as a potboiler, written simply to get his hands on a £100 advance. Neither novel would be even allowed to be printed during his lifetime. And there's a pattern to all this. Generally speaking, Orwell seems to have decided shortly after, or in some cases before publication, that what he'd written was a mess, in which a promising idea or good material had somehow defied his ability to render it down. Even 1984, he told his friend Malcolm Muggeridge, was a good idea that had crumbled in his hands. And if the books are failures, so are the people who wander around in them. Each of Orwell's protagonists, when it comes down to it, is a study in failure, a matter of life not sustaining its early promise, of dreams cast down into dust. Florrie, in Burmese days, is a lonely fantasist whose best years have been squandered in drink and whoring. Dorothy, in The Clergyman's Daughter, is an old maid at 28. Gordon Comstock, in Keep the Orchestra Flying, is a moth-eaten minor poet turned sour by his private fruits. Even George Barlow, in Coming Up for Air, perhaps the most resourceful and worldly, and the least like Orwell of this desperate crew, is irrevocably caught up in the ooze and stagnation of a life lived out with the mirthless Hilda in the shadow of approaching war. Each of Orwell's novels, by extension, is the story of a rebellion that fails, of an individual, in the case of Animal Farm, a mini-society, who, whoever feebly or obliquely attempts to throw over the traces. Each ends in more or less the same way, with the protagonist humbled, defeated, sent back to square one. Florrie shoots himself. Dorothy returns to the sedative thraldom of her father's rectory. Gordon succumbs to the insidious embrace of the money god. George Barlow creeps home to a West London suburb in shame. And Winston Smith, brainwashed and re-educated, knows that he loves Big Brother. There's no way out. The best one can hope for is a kind of coming to terms with the weight of this environmental quicksand. The he is dead but won't lie down idea peddled in the epigraph to Coming Up for Air, or Julia's We're Not Dead Yet in 1984. The truly startling thing about this atmosphere of failure, inanition and spiritual servitude is that it is Orwell talking about himself.